Hello, everyone. My name is Ebony. I am a senior artist and instructor here at More Beauty Love, and we are going to do some practice brows. So, for our first one, this one is a dual flow. This type of style is a very popular. The one that sets this one apart from the rest of the ones that we're going to do, the spine is a little bit higher towards the top perimeter. So I've already tattooed one brow, and we are going to pre-draw and tattoo the second together. So I've already started and divided my brow into different sections, just so when you're tattooing and pre-drawing, you know exactly where to pre-draw your strokes. So we're going to start at the tail and draw our spine first, starting at the second line from the tail and just following the top perimeter. Like I said, this spine is a little bit higher, so we want to make sure that we mimic the same on this brow. And then following forward, and then you're going to pull it pretty close to the front. This one is going to go to about the third line from the head of the brow. So when you're doing your pre-draw, you always want to start on the tail. This is going to help when you are trying to just find the flow of the brow. So we're going to start on our first stroke. This one is going to be right on the perimeter line, and this is just going to secure our shape. So it comes from the tail all the way to the second line from the tail, a little bit past it. Because we are doing pixelated strokes, those last few dots are going to shrink down to where the actual line is. And then going into our second stroke here, this one is starting right into the perimeter at the top. So you're going to start it there in between, right in between the last stroke or the last line and the second line from the tail. And then pulling that one to the third line from the tail. And then our third stroke here is going to hit the very perimeter and also the spine. So this one is going to be hitting the spine and then also starting that one at the second line from the tail and then bringing it all the way down to the fourth line. All right, so we're going to keep going. So when you're drawing your strokes coming from the body of the brow, you want to make sure that you really follow the spine and then fall off. The last thing you want to do is start at the perimeter and then come into the spine, and then the strokes are not going to be the same flow. So that's what you're seeing right now. This fourth stroke is going to fall right in between, a little bit past the perimeter. Like I said, the pixelated strokes, those last few dots typically will shrink down to where the actual perimeter line is when you map your client. So you can see I'm following my spine and then I fall off right where the fifth line is, right underneath where the spine is. Sorry, fourth line, not fifth line. And then coming down and then hitting right where the third line from the head of the brow. And then I'm going to continue to do the same. So I'm following my spine, and this is going to help with the flow. So if you typically go the opposite, I would recommend trying it this way, and then you'll realize the flow of your brows are a lot different. So now that we have all of our strokes at the bottom of the spine, we're going to head to the head of the brow. So these ones you're going to pull straight from the bottom perimeter, right in between the first and second line from the head. And you're going to follow that flow that we initially have, and it's going to come past the third line from the head. And then onto the second head stroke. So still following the flow that we initially had. And this one sits right in between the first and second line. And then we have a little baby stroke right at the head of the brow. So this one is not necessarily hitting the perimeter. It's going to float right in between. Typically, the head of the brow, you'll have a lot more softer head strokes. Nobody wants anything that's too heavy, so you want to make sure that it's nice and soft. So now we're going to go in for the top of the spine, and we're going to start at the perimeter and pull it down to the spine. So you can do it this way, or you can go from the spine and come up. Either one is fine. You just want to make sure that you're following the same flow. And then this very last one, you are going to hit right on the perimeter, but this one does not touch the spine. So this is our skeleton, as you can see. And now we are going to start tattooing. So starting at the very tail, we're going to start at the first stroke that we created. So when you're tattooing, you always want to make sure you whip prior to connecting to the skin. This is going to help you get into the flow. When you get into your head strokes, your hair strokes, sorry, so you're going to do about 10 to 15 whips per hair stroke. This is going to give you the proper amount of overlap per stroke, so that way you have a really good saturation. And this will make sure you are on it every single time. Sometimes it depends on your machine speed. Your hand speed is a big factor. And then also how long your whips are. As you can see, my whips are not extremely long, but because this is a practice brow, the brow itself is pretty big. So my whips are according to the size of the brow. So if the brow is a lot smaller, you'll see the whips become a lot shorter. So now what I am doing, so when you start at the tail of the brow, when you're tattooing, a lot of times you'll start at the very tail and then you'll work your way forward. The way that I like to do it is starting at the tail and tattoo every single stroke and then go to the head of the brow, only because as you start to tattoo, your hand starts to rest on the brow. So you don't want to go all the way from the tail all the way to the head of the brow from the bottom of the spine and then come back to the top, because your hand is going to be all over it and you may lose your strokes. So you want to make sure that you secure every inch of your pre-draw, every inch of the outline. You want to make sure you do not lose that, because that is the shape that your client desires. So as I start to whip, you'll see me turn my practice skin. So with that, you always want to make sure that you're pulling towards you. And that is why I'm turning my practice skin, to make sure that I'm at the right angle. The last thing you want to do is get out of that angle that you need, and then you'll have less control. And it will affect your outcome of what your brows look like. So we're going to continue to whip. Because this stroke is a little bit longer, you'll see my whips are a little bit longer than what they were at the very tail of the brow, which is okay because I'm still getting the same amount of overlap because I'm adding more whips for this stroke. Because the stroke is a lot longer, my whips are going to be a lot more to have the same amount of saturation. And then the same with this one, you'll start to see me turning my practice skin. And then with this technique, you can also work from the spine and tattoo towards the perimeter. The goal is to make sure that your entry and your exit still have a very soft look. So if you are working on your exit to where it doesn't have any blunt edges, things like that, or working on your entry, sometimes you'll have to play with it just to kind of see what is more comfortable for you. So for this one, I'm just demonstrating if I was to work from the spine and work to the perimeter. And if you look, you'll see my very tips of my strokes are still the same. So that is the goal. You want to make sure you see those pixels at the very tail of the stroke. That is going to make sure you have a very soft look. So now getting into the head strokes. So I am now working technically behind my client and pulling towards me that way. And very last stroke. And you can see this stroke is a lot smaller. So you'll see my whips are a lot closer together. And that is to ensure that I have the same amount of saturation. So we are going to go ahead and wipe. And this is our first pass. We're going to do a second pass on this as well. Same as if you were working on your client, you'll do your first and second pass. Typically, you want to get as much possible done in the first pass. You want to make sure you have a good amount of saturation, because the client has been laying. You don't want to do too many passes, and then it's like your client is in agony or anything like that. So as you can see, my saturation is good. I just want to make sure that I have the right amount of saturation. But this too is very different. We are working on practice skin. It's not the same as if you were working on a client. So you just want to make sure that you are going over your strokes in the right way. Two, because this I have the amount of saturation that I'm looking for, I'm not going over the whole stroke. So if you really look, so I'm not touching the very tips of my strokes. I'm mainly focusing in the center of the stroke just to add a little bit of density. So you see I skipped the very tip and I'm going right into the body of the stroke and then exiting out, because that's where I want the most saturation. I want the depth right in the center of the stroke. And you can see me doing it same here, right in the body. And then once you get to where the spine is, this is where you'll see me go over it multiple times. For the spine of the brow, that is where you'll have the most amount of overlapping, because this part of the brow you'll hit multiple times, whether it is your skeleton strokes, whether it's your secondary strokes, whether it's just you want to add more density and your client doesn't have a lot of hair, you'll hit that area multiple times. You'll see as I continue to work, but that's where you'll have the most amount of passes, is where the spine is. And one thing you'll see differently about this second pass is my whips are a little bit longer, because I want a little bit more density. And with that, I want to make sure that I see a lot more pixels, because I want it to look really, really natural, really soft. You'll see me widening my whip. But two, that's something that not everybody needs to do. That's something that I've done and it works. That first stroke, it has the level of saturation that I'm looking for. So I don't want to go over that too many times. And two, remember, that is where we want the softest look. So sometimes you may not need to go over the first, maybe one or two strokes, because you want it to look very natural. So this is my second pass. And as you can see, I have the saturation that I'm looking for. And we will get into our second pass. Okay, so now we are getting into our secondary hair strokes. So for this one, we have already drawn in our secondary. So these ones are coming straight off the primary strokes. So they're branching right off in between each hair stroke that we previously done our skeleton. This is what I wanted to make sure I kept, is that flow that we initially saw in the practice brow, the demonstration. So what you'll see me do is start on the first one, and then we'll tattoo all the way into the previous stroke. So you're not stopping right at that stroke. You want to make sure you connect them, because if you don't, you'll see a gap. That's what we do not want. So we want to make sure that we follow all the way through. So with the pre-draw, you'll see the pencil is a lot thicker than the actual needle, as we all know, but you'll see some of the pre-draws may be hitting the stroke in front of it, things like that. So you have to make sure when you're on your client, your pencil needs to be as thin as possible. Because if your pencil is too thick, you don't know where to tattoo. So to minimize any confusion, you want to make sure your pencil is really, really thin, as thin as possible before it breaks, possibly. So that's what we see here. But like I said previously, practice skin is very different than clients, but ultimately we want to be able to do these things on our clients. So I want to make sure that I set you guys up for success. So you'll see me continue all the way up, continuing to branch all of my strokes, connecting all the way through to the spine, all the way through to the stroke behind it. That is the goal. We don't want to have any gaps in these brows. We want to make sure that they are connecting. Making sure you're always whipping before you hit the skin. That is a very, very big tip. You want to make sure that you whip prior to connecting to the skin, whether you're on practice skin or if you're on your client. This is going to help you get into your rhythm and making sure that you don't go down and then your pressure is too heavy, things like that. You just want to avoid those types of things. And we're going to continue up into our head strokes. So branching all the way back to the previous stroke behind it. Same thing for the head strokes. The only difference is the very front of the brow, we're not going to branch off of. It's going to float right in between because, like I said, the front of the brow, we want to make sure that is the softest. And if you look at a natural brow, the very few hairs in the front, there's not a lot. So we want to make sure that we mimic exactly what the client has. And then once we do that, we are going to wipe. All right, so now that we have wiped, we are now going to go in and pre-draw some more branching strokes. So these ones are going to branch right off of the secondary strokes that we just tattooed. And the reason I'm doing this is because there's still a gap. There's still a gap in between every skeleton stroke that we tattooed. So we want to make sure that we fill that. That is the goal, to give it as natural as possible, but not just natural. You still want to make sure that you have a good amount of spacing. Spacing is very, very important. So even at the very tips of the strokes, sometimes your skeleton strokes may be close enough. You may not need to branch all of your secondary all the way to the perimeter. You want to make sure that you still have a good amount of space. So when your client comes back, they still have hair strokes. That is the goal. You do not want to crowd your strokes. I'm going to say it again. Do not crowd your strokes. That is very, very important. Your client is coming to you because they want hair strokes. So when they come back in a year, 2 years, 3 years, ultimately you still want to see hair strokes. That's the goal, is to give them hair strokes long term. So I cannot stress this enough. Spacing is very, very, very important. So now we are going to go in. We're tattooing these strokes that we just pre-drew. Pre-drew? Maybe. Okay. We're going to go with it. So pre-drawn on our skeleton that we just did. So we're going to go in. We're going to tattoo all of these, making sure you're connecting. Connect those to those skeleton strokes and the primary strokes and secondary strokes. Sorry. Skeleton and secondary strokes that we tattooed. So following all the way through. There should be none of your secondaries floating in the air, especially if they're right by the spine or in the body of the brow. The goal is to make sure that they connect for this pattern. And then continuing all the way up until we hit the head of the brow. And then we have the little small head stroke up here, the secondary. So if you can look, my brow, it has a good amount of spacing. We don't have a bunch of strokes that are too close together. You can't see through. That is the goal for this style. You want it to leave it very nice, soft, airy. That's the goal. So now that we wiped, I want to start adding some dimension to the brow. So what I'm going to do, you're going to see me tattoo where the spine is, just getting into where the spine is, but also connecting it to where some of our primary strokes are. So right into the spine, we're tattooing, and you're going to see me going just slightly onto some of our skeleton strokes. So not hitting the whole stroke, just where it connects to the spine. This is going to give you the dimension that you're looking for. This is what sets it apart. This is what gives it the movement that you're looking for. We don't like flat brows. We want to make sure that it looks realistic. We want a hyper realistic brow. And this is what's going to set it apart. This is what makes it look realistic. So you can see me, I'm only going over some of my skeleton strokes. So I'm not going over every single stroke, because then they're all going to have the same dimension. They're all going to have the same amount of saturation, the same kind of look. And that's what we don't want. So I'm only going over certain strokes. I'm not going over every single stroke. That's not the goal. So once I wipe, you'll see now I'm starting to see a little bit more color. That's what I want. That's the money shot right there. So now that I have my spine, everything has a good amount of saturation. The spine and some of those skeleton strokes coming from the spine, those have the look that we're going for. That's what's going to make it look realistic. And that's our first brow.